All right. Am I audible and visible? All right. Nice. Hi, I'm Neil. Yo, never mind. Okay, nice. Pronunciation? Yeah, let's go. Start my speech in three, two, one. The Olympics, the FIFA World Cup, have been hives of scum and villainy. Thousands losing their homes to make space for a shiny arena, thousands of jobs lost after the fact, billions of dollars in debt, all for the bragging rights of hosting an event. We ought just let one country host it. Few pieces of context to set up this debate. One, what countries usually host these events in status quo and why? So note that OP cannot really change the way that these sporting bodies choose the countries. Like we don't have much fiat. Like we operate based on incentives. So let's resolve why we allow these incentives to turn good on our side of the house later. So how then do they get chosen? So usually it's through things like bidding. So often under the table deals that make the top officials richer, even though pragmatically it might not be the best choice. And recently, it's been countries with the horrible track records. See Qatar with the World Cup, China with the Olympics in 2008, Saudi Arabia, you know the works. But this is for a few reasons. Because one, you want to clean up the reputation, like usually human rights abuses. Second, they want the economic injection. They want more cash flow. And third, they want to flaunt their newfound wealth. It's an ego thing. So comparatively, I think with a new incentive to save as much money as possible, or to be as efficient with the way that you spend your money, the sporting bodies are likely to choose countries are likely to choose better countries. So it could be a vote by all member countries that is heavily vetted, for example. So, for example, the Olympics could be permanently hosted in the USA because it could be likely that the countries vote for that for a few reasons. Like, for example, like they're most developed. They have baseline infrastructure that is like hotel, TV infrastructure, and they already have the arenas that already exist. The second, they're most likely the most socially inclusive, which means less points of conflict between rival teams and, for example, very, very passionate fans. And the reason why that's likely is immense pressure from these sorts of countries to make sure that the sporting events that they go to are not necessarily controversial at all. So the second one is, can you change the host country then in times of crisis? We think yes, in some instances, the board can probably vote to change the permanent host nation in times of trouble, if like e.g. if the host nation were undergoing a major crisis or that corruption exists. So but by default, that is the host country. Well, who will fund this then? We think that one, just given the fact that these countries are likely to be extremely developed, immediately already have prior infrastructure that exists, any additional funding is likely to be minuscule. But I would think that it's probably like all participating countries could probably give a contribution in return for a proportional share in TV or other type of revenue. It's likely not going to be a huge contribution once again, because you already have the necessary infrastructures. Two major arguments for this speech. Are developing countries better off? Because it is often the hubris of backsliding democratic states to make sure that they are able to put $40 billion out of a $200 billion national budget into having having a nice shiny arena, but like thousands of people are starving. So insofar as we prevent these developing nations from like hosting these international events just as a function of this new incentive and like what the world is likely to look like, we think we win this debate. Because one, what does happen within these countries' economies and the communities? So I already know that Neg is going to say, increase the amount of money spent within the country's borders, you reinvigorate the economy. Like we consider this probably true to some extent that you do encourage some sort of investment, and I'm taking their best case here. But the problem has to be with the total amount, right? Like for example, you can only fit so many tourists in Rio de Janeiro or Lusail in Qatar. So comparatively, we just do not allow these developing countries to host the Olympics or the World Cup insofar as the member countries understand that it's incredibly expensive and these countries are just not ready. It is the fact that thousands of poor households living in the ghettos of Rio de Janeiro were thrown out violently to make space for the arena for the World Cup in 2016. Like given that, then you are not going to be able to recoup that amount of money that you spent. And this is just factually true. For example, China spent $40 billion to earn $5 billion. Even London in 2012, the most frugal Olympics in recent times, lost over $15 billion because of the fact that the Olympics just don't make that much money if you have to build everything from the ground up over and over again. The second is that corruption within these developing nations siphons billions out of funds that could potentially be funneled into more pertinent concerns in these countries. The scenario in reality is that more often than not, these countries who host these large-scale events barely break even. Like, so sure, you're able to show the world that these cities are packed to the brim with tourists, but once again, when everything is said and done, the margin of profit just does not exist. So the reason why countries still bid is because the people making these decisions are not the ones who are affected by these expenses. It is the people who live on top of ivory towers who spend billions and billions of tax money because they want to see Ronaldo and Messi fight it out in the finals of the World Cup. By the way, they probably never will. So the third layer here then is what happens after the fact. So maybe you get money, right? Like let's show them their very best case. Maybe you break even. You get things like ghost towns or unused facilities that are incredibly harmful. Because one, these international facilities are often made in places that are far from civilian access because of risk reduction, i.e., security reasons. They don't want the Olympians to get mobbed. They want to keep transportation clear. And it's often marginally cheaper that way to not use prime land. But second, it's like local events are just often so much smaller. So there's no use to use huge stadiums if it's only going to be like a little league game or like a U16 game or something like that. So it looks like empirically, there were so many buildings used by both workers and Olympians alike after the 2016 Olympics that were abandoned and unused after the fact. The huge buildings that the Olympics used were incredibly expensive and had little to no use afterwards. The stadiums, the water parks that were used are green with mold, are completely run down because the government did not have the money nor the incentive to maintain multi-billion-dollar stadiums. That is a lot of wasted money and prime real estate that probably would have gone like somewhat to like helping people on the ground then. But the third is that after the fact, you have huge debts because of things like maintenance costs, because of the fact that you just do not earn money from these international sporting events. Because guess what? TV rights, for example, TV rights, the amount of money that you get from advertisers are nothing compared to the billions, the tens of billions of dollars that you need in order to create new stadiums. So even if the best case that happens, once again, see the London 2012 Olympics plus $15 billion on a $20 billion investment, you are still going to lose money. So on outside, these countries don't get the rude awakening of losing billions from shouldering the cost. We are likely to choose countries that are likely to have a lot more developed stadiums, for example, like the USA, if you want to choose the Olympics, because they already have a lot of stadiums that is probably just going to be maintenance costs and other sorts of auxiliary costs that are probably going to be covered by everyone in the IOC anyway. So at the impact of this, or that we're at the very least, any country that would have hosted these events are likely are likely not able to. And the fact that we're not allowing them because of the fact that we changed the incentives means that the people within these countries are probably not going to be built. Like life is probably still going to suck, but it's going to suck a lot less, right? So the second argument here is why do our sporting events better off? So we think that one, you have a more effective use of resources and funds. Because on NEG, the host for these events change every few years, i.e. the Olympics change every 4 years. The major problems to that are that one, you have to build new stadiums and facilities because the host always changes. It limits the amount of sports or the amount of participants that can participate. Because when you're newly bid as a host, you have 4 years, you have to rush the stadium, cost constraints, having to rush the money allocation. So on that op's best, maybe a host country repeats, but the harm is unpredictability, which don't know if they will, right? So on app, you have one sink of money, which is at one, you have higher capacity. It's able to guarantee that you focus on one or two stadiums, which means that you're probably able to save a lot of money. But two, it's also longevity. You're probably able to put a lot more money into maintenance costs to make sure that the quality of these stadiums are good and are able to take a long time anyway. But second, it's a greater appreciation of sport. On NEG, there's always the problem of controversy, guys. There's always going to be controversy surrounding big events that are shown to lose profits. And it's compounded by the greed that most countries exhibit when it comes to making sure they win the bid, i.e. Qatar bribing different members of FIFA in the voting process. On AF, you remove the politicking, you don't allow it to affect the sport. So it could not be true that there could be initial controversy, but in the grand scheme of things, that is unlikely to match the controversy of a new host country every 4 years. Like imagine if the World Cup were just held in Britain. Some people are going to murmur, but that's nothing compared to having South Africa, then Brazil, then Russia, then Qatar holding it. So even if NEG says it's unlikely to be controversial, it has to be under risk. But two, the bidding process in and of itself is controversial. So increase tensions between nations. For all the reason more, because we're able to help developing nations because they don't put billions, because you don't want them to. For all the reason more, I'm incredibly proud to affirm.
All right, we thank the speaker for that speech. Can we have the first negative speaker to introduce the next case here? By the way, guys, if you see my camera turn off halfway, it's because the Wi-Fi at Rob's place drops a little bit every now and then. So yeah.
Sorry for the delay. I'm gonna get started. 3, 2, 1. The affirmative team in this debate have a question that they basically don't answer. If it's reliably true that countries expect to not make an immediate profit from hosting the Olympic Games or for hosting the FIFA World Cup, why do they do it? Every 4 years, multiple countries bid, some lose and some get it because they want it for some reason. And there's no compelling answer in that affirmative speech about why exactly that is. And we would contest that it's probably far more charitable than, oh, they're just the rich elite of the country who want to do it for an ego trip. It's probably because there are other economic benefits to doing this. For instance, it is the justification uniquely that you as a developing nation can provide to build a rigorous public transport infrastructure in your city. It is the money that you can justify now into building huge amounts of affordable medium density housing to host all the people that are now in the short term coming to your country to do tourism. It is the long-term benefit of attention on your nation and your nation's culture that obviously in the short term translates into huge quantities of tourism into your country, but in the long run translates in greater attention and like returning tourism, people who want to invest in your country. Those economic benefits clearly stand, clearly justify why, yeah, maybe it's not profitable in the immediate term if you take the most uncharitable view of this debate, but you ought not be that short-sighted. Question 1 I'm going to ask in this speech is, who will be the permanent hosts? And we think it's pretty likely to be a set of really rich Western developed nations, for the reason that are given to at first affirmative, that these are the countries that have infrastructure, cities like London, cities like Paris, New York, or Atlanta, that probably can justify it on the basis of what they already have. The bidding process is likely to be for a permanent host of a huge, or like the FIFA World Cup, hugely intense. So the countries with the most political lobbying power, most financial power, are going to be the ones that are going to be able to successfully capture it. So America doesn't always want to host the World Cup or the Olympic Games, but if you could never host them again, you could never have the benefit of having an Olympic Games in its own territory, it would bid intensely and it would become the permanent host. We also think there's a subsidiary likelihood that countries that are seen as the capital of their sport would be given it permanently, like the most, where that's what happens the most. Why would a permanent host then be destructive? The first is it would corrupt the fundamental meaning of international sporting events. International sporting events like the Olympic Games, like the FIFA World Cup, are political unifiers. Because sport is easy to understand, because it unites people across culture, because it is a universal language, because it produces inspiring narratives of people from your country, which may be a poor or developing country, succeeding on the international stage. See, for instance, at a time of political crisis, how galvanizing having the Olympic Games was for the world during COVID. Why that then changes for the worse? Because the perception of sports now fundamentally changes. There's clearly now a divide between the developed and developing world when it comes to hosting sports. When you have the likelihood or the literal fact of a major sporting event being held in your nation, it inspires people to pick up the sports. It inspires people to participate in grassroots sport. It inspires people to have national pride. That is valuable to nations. That kind of political spirit is actually pretty important. But we would say sports breaks down stereotypes that exist about countries and exist around particular geographical regions, because it places attention onto them, because it allows you as a country, like, yeah, we're capable of hosting a really sophisticated and well-run event because we run because we're like Qatar and we run it really effectively. Like you are able to break down stereotypes about your nation. Thirdly, you're able to signal the rich culture of your nations because people travel to them, they do tourism, because there is an additional attention that is placed on your country because it's now highly visible and there's a lot of media attention, but because you have the specific incentive to market the event around a specific culture, but also because the architecture of the stadium often reflects it. This forces people who would otherwise never engage with the cultures of developing nations to engage with them in a way that reduces their prejudice towards them, that causes them to educate themselves about the conception they have about those countries. That is pretty important in this debate. Fourthly, it builds a sense of national pride when you can no longer host the Olympics or the World Cup or expect that you will be able to in the future. You no longer are invested in grassroots sports in your area, or you are invested far less. Fifthly, at worst, they say that the focus will be used by pernicious countries like Qatar to sports wash human rights crimes. We say that's fine because the opposite effect almost always accrues, where the attempt to do this just places more attention on those crimes. Ask yourself the intuitive question, has the Qatar World Cup been positive for the international image of a country that is doing human rights abuses? And the answer to that question is clearly no, because it has just had the effect of increasing the scrutiny on those human rights abuses. We think that's good for spurring on change and drawing attention to that. You look to other examples, like, for instance, Russia hosting the Winter Olympics in Sochi and how there was attention onto that. Obviously, there are a suite of benefits to countries that otherwise would host it when the permanent host is set up in the developed world that are lost. Why is this hugely economically beneficial for countries that opt to host it? It is only with the huge tourism influx and the huge influx of media attention that you expect to get when you host an international sporting event that you can justify the level of spending that you can do on cities that is just enormous. Things like building effective public transport networks, things like building public housing, things like building sports stadiums that build grassroots sports networks that allow the sports to grow in those countries. You can only justify that spending when you expect there to be a huge influx of money entering into your country. Look to examples like the Sydney Olympic Park, which used to be an industrial wasteland, which used to be a part of the city of Sydney, which was literally a piece of economic disaster. It is now a functional, 22 years later, sport area that is used regularly by the community. It has a sophisticated public transport network now. That is clearly positive. Look to examples like China having the incentive to increase its oxygen quality by 20 to 30% in 2008 to be a hospitable host of the Olympics. You can only justify those kinds of economic investment when you expect the revenue to enter into your countries. So you have the incentive to do that. Obviously, this massively increases tourism, both in the obvious short term, with the influx of people who enter because you are going to the Olympics or because you're going to host the Olympics, but also in the long term, because the cultural attention that is placed on your nation, on the norms that it has and how wonderful those countries are, promotes tourism to them in the long term. Because people who came for the Olympics return, people who watch the Olympics want to go. That's economically beneficial in the long term for your country. But you also have the incentive to build resources for your country that promote grassroots sport. We think that's a good thing in this debate. This debate is actually pretty simple. Hosting these sporting events is hugely beneficial to developing nations that do it, and developed nations should not have a monopoly on it. That would be disastrous. For that reason, proud to negate. Oh, by the way, you might want to turn your camera off if you're going to openly scorn a speech.
Sorry, what? Sorry, what did Oscar say?
I was just saying to the other team, they should turn their camera off if they're going to react like they are to speeches.
Oh. All right. Can we have the first negative the second affirmative speaker to advance the F's case? Here.
All right, thanks. Oh, also, just my apologies for keeping my camera on. I really did not notice. I just turned it on for the first affirmative, but then I just forgot to turn it off for the first negative. So, that's completely on me. I'll make sure to turn it off during the next speeches. Okay. So hello, my name is David from the CND. Yeah. All right. All right. Starting in 3, 2, and sorry, starting in 3, 2, and 1. The reason why negative loses from the first speech alone is for 2 reasons. The first is in terms of likelihood. So never do they explain why these instances of Australia or China are more likely for a typical developing country who are bound to the incentives that Neil explains. But then secondly, even if you talk about like things such as likelihood, it is the fact that they don't really explain like how you outweigh this in terms of scale, right? Like just because you reduce like the stereotypes in terms of a certain country has literally no effect if that same country is going to be in debt for millions and billions, right? In terms of a lack of comparison coming from the first negative speech, I just think that the affirmative is winning from coming from the first exchange. So let's count that. Few debate winning things in my speech. Firstly, on developing countries, and this will deal with all of the benefits that they claim. Secondly, where sporting events are better off, and I'd like to note that first negative does not respond to half of our case. And then lastly, just some best case way. Before that, let's talk about some framing. So again, I just think that first negative just agrees to the frame that we explained, which is it's likely to be the most developed and uncontroversial countries are likely going to be the permanent host because of the fact of immense pressure, right? Like the connotation that this is literally the permanent home of the Olympics, the permanent home of the FIFA World Cup. So when push comes to shove, when these countries are like when this like sporting body is made to choose on paper, what are the questions that would be asked? It's things like where are the most stadiums? How can we be the most inclusive so that more countries participate? And obviously, in that sense, the most likely occurrence is things like the US, things like like in the West, as we completely agree with negative. Next then, let's talk about developing countries. The first thing I have to point out is it is likely that developing countries are going to be bid on their side of the house. Let's explain this. The reason is developing countries are often more desperate for the speculative benefits of tourism relative to developed countries. They are more desperate because of the lack of their finances. All of the things that Neil says, wanting to look good, flaunting newfound wealth, a chance at economic injection, the short-termism that they will look good, and for all of the speculative things that they try to define, compared to a developed nation that doesn't need this that much. So given this, what then do they say? The first thing that they say is, they get a surge of economic and cultural benefits now and in the long term. The first thing to point out is that is untrue, right? Like the major thing to point out here is that it is just factually false. Like even London losing $15 billion, China losing $35 billion, they do this because they want to have soft power. And they make an assertion that they make money. Like why would they do it otherwise? When we explain that there are other reasons aside from money that they do this. The second thing is to like the reason as to why this is untrue. It's just because like think about it, right? It's just a 1-month event. So I don't see why people would care about the benefit, like the cultural benefits of Qatar long in the future, when after that Olympics, they now focus on the next Olympics, they now focus on the next World Cup, so that attention shifts over time and immediately. So it's at their best, it is severely mitigated, and I don't know the extent to which it affects in the long term. But even then, it is incredibly short-termist. The reason why they overestimate is because of unpredictability. So it is empirically untrue that people will suddenly care about Brazilian culture, for example, in the long term for the reason I explained. But at best, this is not even exclusive, and this is asserted that this is exclusive, right? Because notice that the whole notion of the Olympics, the whole notion of the World Cup is used for multiculturalism because it's literally the biggest international event in the world. So even in Qatar, in status quo, yet with a rotating host, you have a Korean singer who performed the main World Cup song. You have people who are designated a lot of different kind of roles like in the international community. I don't see what's stopping the USA from doing the same thing, given that this is an inherent facet of the Olympics that you have to be multiculturalist. The second that they say is you lose the meaning of the sport. I'd like to note this is not true because you have increased politicization when you go through the controversy. In fact, long term, you could probably make sports even more politically neutral if you spend more time just having the host country in the background while having more time focused on focusing on the athletes then, given that you don't have to have the stir of where the next country is going to be, right? Wait then against our material, where we tell you that insofar as you have that lack of controversy, this is not true. But I want to be very clear, not all countries can host it anyway. So there are benefits on inspiring grassroots sports only happens to a very small minority of countries. The next thing that they say, and the last thing that they say, is it decreases stereotypes on a country. That is not true. Because as they say, sports often take center stage. And as a result, people care disproportionately about the sport because people care in the World Cup about football, in FIBA about like basketball. So people, like most people, just care about turning on the TV, watching their games, supporting their respective countries because sports are, as they say, often nationalist, and they don't necessarily have the forethought to think about every other country out there. Just even if they did want to consider all of the countries, it is also more than 100 countries out there that could possibly, like, you can't possibly focus your attention on one. So insofar as this response flies, I don't know what other possible stereotypes exist. And I just think first negative kind of just says this abstract notion of what reducing stereotypes without actually explaining what these stereotypes look like and if they even exist in status quo. Even if this is true, this does not outweigh the other harms to apply. If this is true, then that's bad. Like if the argument is true, then that's bad, right? Because now it's justifications to defend corrupt nations, saying we'll excuse Qatar and China for now because they hosted the games, right? So obviously these things are either not true or bad. Secondly, we say developing countries are worse as a result because of ghost towns. The increased revenue within the space of the month that the Olympics is happening is nothing compared to the years and years of lost revenue if that space had been used to legitimately positively impact the community with hospitals, schools, or etc., or just literally anything else that doesn't waste billions of dollars, and that outweighs because of, even if stereotypes are lost, right? Like congrats, a lot of people are in poverty, but also it's debts from maintenance costs or land maintenance, which awfully got no response from the previous speaker. So there are a few points of weighing as to why this beats them. One is in terms of unpredictability, that sure, maybe there's only a limited extent to which countries can predict their own budgets, right? So it's when you actually are in that place and you do have to expend all of that money that you do incur all of the harms we explain. But secondly, it's risk. Even if it's small, it's a non-zero chance on their side versus literally 0% on ours when a developed country can handle the costs long term, does it? But lastly, it's vulnerability. So even if negative says developing countries will only host like 1% of the time, or maybe it's true that a country will only die 1% of the time financially, right? It is a fact that these countries are hit most. So we don't necessarily care other countries who can handle it because they could handle it. And this got no response from the previous speech. And I think that second negative has a lot of work to do. What did we say? One, it's better for accommodating players and better for the quality of the actual event itself, because venues and facilities are often lower quality on their house, and it limits the amount of sports or the amount of participants that can participate, because when you are newly bidded as a host, it's time constraints. It's having to rush a stadium in a few years, and it's cost constraints. It's having to rush money allocation in a few years. And at best case, even if even if a host like repeats itself, right? It's because like the whole ghost town thing happens, and you have to renew these kinds of things and have exponential costs in the long term. On our side, you funnel constant funding from all participating countries into one huge area, which means you can funnel that money into expanding into more participants for sports in that one area, expanding the number of sports that can be posted on that area. But it's also better appreciation for the sport, right? And this isn't some abstract thing. This is a real harm. It's more media time dedicated to bidding process versus on our side, able to focus on things like media coverage of national teams and give them revenue from that. A real difference in terms of how many ads and revenue we can give to fund athletes, etc. But lastly, it's better for workers and human rights. Countries like Qatar that just don't care about human rights, that can act benevolent or act okay in the short term on their side, and then suddenly kill thousands of workers on their side of the house. At next best case, even if a country isn't corrupt or isn't authoritarian, you cannot deny that there are so abuses that will happen. And the reason being is these events are viewed to be the most important. So because of time constraints when a new country is bid, there's a rush to funnel so many workers, likely to putting their working standards in the backseat. And it doesn't matter if you're harmed, it doesn't matter if you die, because the most important thing is hosting every single country in the world. And therefore on our side, you're able to have things like more first of all, it's in a developed country where you're less likely to have these things. Second of all, you have less of the time constraints, so there's less of a rush to abuse workers. But third of all, it's more of an impetus to have legislation because in that certain country, because it's literally only one country responsible, versus on their side of the house when that responsibility shifts over and over. For those reasons, the workers are better, the athletes are better, the sport is better, and the Olympics are better. Proud to propose.
Thank you very much. Can we have the second negative speaker? Yeah.
Also before that, Neil, Khristine.
Okay. Can you hear me? Awesome. The United States have a monopoly over technology. They have a monopoly over clothing brands. They have a monopoly over fast food. They have a monopoly over most major airline alliances. For the love of God, please don't let them have a monopoly over something like the Olympics, something that almost uniquely unifies a country, that gives them something to look forward to, that gives them hope, that single-handedly unites people because of its accessibility, allowing the US to be the only country that is ever able to host these events by making the Olympics a quasi Super Bowl would be so unbelievably regrettable. The Olympics is a historical tradition. It is something that people have looked forward to for generations to be given the privilege to host it. It would be absolutely awful if this would only happen in the US. Two things in this speech. Firstly, the impact on sport, and secondly, the impact on the economy. The reason why I'm going to start with the impact on sport is because I think that this affirmative team significantly minimizes the importance of sport in popular culture, but also in politically unifying a nation, in giving people hope and something to look forward to, and in giving people the ability to see themselves represented in the people who they look up to and who they idolize, and the way that allowing this monopoly would significantly decrease the ability of sport to do that. So, even if it is economically detrimental for a country to host the Olympics or the World Cup, what are the impacts of sport on? Because I'm going to prove that the perception of sport changes for the worse, and I think there are three reasons why this is true. Firstly, far less people participate in that sport in the long term when the only host country is the United States of America. That is because, first of all, you have no sense of national pride to look forward to or to have when that is taking place in the US. And that's because many developing countries dislike the US, because many developing countries have deep-seated ideological differences with the US. That means that they are never going to be on side with them. And so that means that these countries, even if the players themselves don't opt out, the spectators certainly opt out of the process. But what this means is that you don't inspire a whole bunch of younger people and new generations to get excited about sport, because it is when the Olympics or the World Cup are not just hosted in your country, but at least in your continent or your region, that you are able to be excited together and have something to look forward to and create future athletes. Second of all, far less people view these sporting arrangements, and there's a few reasons why that's true. First of all, it is always in the same time zone. Second of all, it gets boring when it's always in the same country because people don't want to travel to the same place every year, or at the very least, they get bored of the cultural ensue that follows the United States of America, which is incredibly whitewashed. Thirdly, though, the Olympics become something that is incredibly Americanized. The US has a huge lack of cultural richness. And what that means is that the kind of people that are working for the Olympics, the kind of sponsors that sponsor the Olympics and that are plastered all over things like mascots and t-shirts are incredibly Americanized. That is not only depressing, but for a lot of developing countries, an affront to the things that they stand for. That would be terrible for the people both viewing and playing those sports. The reason why it's important to weigh sporting events in this debate as something that are important is because sporting events are a uniquely unifying activity. And that's because you don't require any capital to opt into watching the Olympics in the same way that you do need, for example, to read literature or to opt into the news, because the average person can watch a game of football, whereas the average person probably has no interest or probably doesn't have the preceded ability to opt into things like the arts. So sport is something that gives people a sense of hope. That hope is severely diluted to a detrimental extent when the only place in which those things take place is the USA. Note the fact that obviously you can still have local sporting events in your country, but the important thing here is that the Olympics and the World Cup, but particularly the Olympics, are so unique in their prestige that the average person watches something so stupid like the modern pentathlon, where they never would otherwise watch an average game of cricket, for example. There is a difference and a lure to the Olympics that average sports will never have. Second of all, let's talk about the impact on the economy. Because this affirmative team is hell-bent on proving that debt is going to be the thing that cripples these economies, that there's no future returns, and that tourism benefits are simply not enough. The first thing I want to start with here is explaining why these countries opt into the process of bidding. Because it is not, as this affirmative team says, an ego trip. Because these countries are aware of the fact they're going to be making a huge loss of the Olympics, but they opt into it anyway. And we think that despite besides the anomaly of cases, most people are rational when they opt in. And why is that true? Because what the Olympics allows them to do, as we tell you at first, is it gives you a reason to build an infrastructure stimulus package that other things never would. Because you need to build things simultaneously, like connectors to stadiums and hotels that can be turned in to housing commissions and stadiums that can become training facilities or education facilities. This gives you a reason and an excuse to build all of those things that you would never otherwise have. The affirmative team then says, well, they need to then maintain these facilities, and that's really expensive. I think the problem here is that maintaining all infrastructure is expensive. It's unclear why this is unique to the infrastructure that you build from the Olympics. You have to maintain your public transport, you have to maintain your public housing commission, so probably you could just do that alongside maintaining the other infrastructure that you already have. But let's now talk about what are the actual impacts of hosting the Olympics. And I think the most important one to start here, there are 5, but the most important one is scrutiny. And there are 3 things to say here. Firstly, the reason why Qatar has been used as a battering ram in this debate is because everyone is so aware of the human rights abuses happening in Qatar at the moment because of the Olympics. The Olympics have uniquely been able to shine a torch on the issues that predate the Olympics being held in Qatar. They allow the average person to be cognizant of the amount of people being exploited in that country. Note the fact that exploitation is not unique to the Olympics. These people would have been exploited on either side. They just would have been put on a different infrastructure project that never would have received the light of media attention like the Olympics. The reason why the Olympics uniquely brings this scrutiny is because it allows major international news organizations to go in and explain what's going on in a way that other projects do not. Because international countries are competing in these events, so that means they have their own media there. That means that Western countries opt in. Second speaker says, well, the attention will just shift after the event's over. The reason why that's not true is because currently there is a paradigm shift in people being far more socially aware than they ever were. Things like Me Too and Black Lives Matter and the Ukraine crisis have given people an air of sympathy that they never have had before. So maybe this was true in the past. It certainly is not true in the present. Qatar is not the worst country to have hosted the Olympics, but the sheer volume of media they have received is proof of the fact that people are finally trying to care. We also tell you about cultural benefits, about stereotype benefits. This team never tells you why this sort of debt is uniquely bad or why debt in itself is a bad thing when you have so many positive externalities because of it. At the end of this debate, sport is crucial in a time where the world is darker than ever. The impact on the economy is not uniquely bad. In fact, it's light on important issues. Very proud to negotiate.
All right, thank you very much. Can we invite the third affirmative speaker to sum up the constructive case for the affirming side? You're here.
Hello, I'm about audible and visible.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me just get my timer. Okay, I'm starting my speech in 3, 2, 1 now. So there are 2 overarching discussions that I will discuss with. The first is with regards to better sporting events, and then the second is with regards to hedging against all the controversies that has been discussed so far in the round. All the responses are integrated. So the first question then that I want to tackle head on is, are we able to have better sporting events for everyone involved? So necessarily not just the teams, necessarily not just the citizens, necessarily not just the people who are hosting the tournament, but as much as possible, all of the people that are involved. Negative says that this is, completely okay because the hypervisibility is worth everything that you go through, all the hassle, all the money that you want to spend, etc., etc. Their main claim is that less people will participate if it's the US because people don't like the US. So the first layer of response to this is untrue, because the conceded premise is people care about the sport the most. This is something that both sides agree with. So people will not care about where it is. They are there to see Ronaldo fucking duke it out with Messi, because as Neg says, they want to have hope by watching their teams. And exactly, we agree with that. That's why they are incentivized to care about Messi more than wherever it is going to be hosted. So they're there to support their team, because nobody goes, oh, I'm going to Qatar World Cup because I want to visit Qatar. But the thing that they say is that, well, I want to support my team, so I'm going to Qatar. That is likely the most realistic scenario that's going to happen. Second layer of response, even if that's true, we hate we hate the US all the time, so I don't want them to host the World Cup or whatever kind of Olympics. But I then, as a country, can just vote for another country, like for example, India, who is currently the country with the biggest seating stadium in the world. So if Nick says that people hate the US so much, then the permanent host can likely be someone else. Like that's within the scope of the motion, that is within the setup that we have provided from first app, that you can just vote for somebody else if you don't like the US. But notably, the US is probably the most uncontroversial choice. So like imagine a Uyghur having to go to Beijing to watch the Olympics. So obviously China is not the most uncontroversial choice that we're going to have. But to cap this off is that it's just confusing to me why there's such a focus on the USA only, when at best, coming from affirmative, this is one of the potential choices from the literal list of other countries who also have existing stadiums, who also have big hotels and have transportation lines. This is not at all exclusive to the USA. I don't know why they're narrowing the debate only to the USA, but also they just completely didn't listen to the setup right up from first app, because sporting events are hosted likely by different countries. So where is the sole US hegemony coming from? Are they going to host the World Cup, the Olympics, the F1, whatever kind of sporting event there is international? Another claim that they want to have under this issue is that they claim that sharing cultures is a top priority. But first their response is that this is not necessarily exclusive, because it already has its status quo. So there's no literal reason for it to not continue. And it's even more important if other nations involved chip in on the funds as per our setup. Like obviously if I was a country involved and I see that the USA, for example, is only exclusively promoting their own culture for literal years, I will get pissy and demand for them to change, or I get my funds. So there is an accountability mechanism for the USA or other hosts to not do that. But the best case then, secondly, is that it changes as you get the new. So that is the best case scenario that you get coming from negative. And it's only short-termist, so there's literally no benefit of them getting it for the long term, because people are likely to shift their focus when there is another country who will likely host the next Olympics or the next FIFA World Cup, etc., etc. But then, pragmatically, what did affirmative prove? That we are better at organization and better at making these sporting events. Because number one, we are able to prove that developed countries or other countries are able to provide the baseline infrastructure and transportation that is required for a huge influx of sports fans, the media ecosystem that can stand to broadcast these matches as wide of a reach as possible, the less probability of problems occurring like women being harassed in airports in Qatar, or the LGBT people being discriminated upon, etc., etc. Secondly, we mitigate the excess of hosting sporting events, like the ghost towns, like lost prime real estate, like unused infrastructure and transportation lines, etc., etc. But then second leg says, more roads can be made, but this is literally unresponsive to the premise coming from our first speech, which is that they're made in places inaccessible to civilians, because large sporting events require lots of hectares of land to necessarily be built upon in the first place. So one, these international facilities are often made in places that are far from civilian access because of risk reduction as well. So security issues as well, like you don't want the Olympians to get mobbed in a certain city that is so congested. They want to keep transportation clear, but though local events are going to be often much smaller, so there's no use to use huge stadiums. But also secondary response is extremely harmful, because insofar as you lose years of development, that is also so many jobs lost. The abstract notion of cultural hegemony and God not America again is nothing compared to the thousands of abused workers, years of lost development, and billions in debt that will be paid off by the people in that country for years. And then lastly, First Leg tries to cherry pick the Sydney Sports Center, that happened because they have the money to develop that land again, because they're a developed country. Places like Brazil just don't. So for every Sydney, there is a rundown Rio Stadium. And that is the kind of realistic scenario that's more likely to happen because of the greed that is inherent in these kinds of politics. On profit, we are also able to prove that you're likely to lose money. That if you have anything to gain, the marginal profit is so minuscule that it does not outweigh all of the other harms that are going to be posited right up from my first app. But also remove the politicking stemming from immense greed and the desire to just sweep all of your reputational concerns under the rug in exchange of a shiny month-long event is also more possible coming from side app. So the overall weighing here is simple, that international sporting events are better off on side app because number one, the basic infrastructure is there. There's no need to actually have a lot of more added expenses. Secondly, these sports events are going to be tainted by corruption and greed coming from side neg. And their best case is that you're going to be able to display that, hey, I'm able to build shiny hotels and stadiums and that people are more exposed to my country's culture. All of this at the cost of having your own people starving. But sure, you stop the hegemony by people, I guess. The second discussion then is, where are we more able to hedge against controversies regarding human rights, etc., etc.? They say it's good because it sheds a light on the abuses of that host country, and they cited Qatar. First their response, this does not make sense because the abuses that happened in Qatar in the first place is exactly because Qatar hosted the World Cup. Like, why will migrant workers have a huge influx there if not to work on building the multitude of stadiums and hotels that didn't exist before the bid? Sure, they look pretty, but what is the long-term benefit to be had if we have proven that, number one, these aren't very accessible, number two, the costs maintained are so immense that no government will be willing to undertake this. There's also a direct response to their material about, well, they will build infrastructure anyway. Second, Neg says, well, there are also maintenance costs to other things like public transportation. The difference is that you funnel billions into a project that is not pertinent to your country, and on top of that, you have to funnel even more money after the event ad infinitum. This is not at all parallel with public transportation because this is a state necessity to actually move around. So what happens is that your citizens are more pissed at you for letting these funds just go to shiny projects. Secondary response, in the case that there is abuse prior to the bid, number one, it's insidious because you are willingly complicit in making marginalized people, women, LGBT, migrants be subjected to the discrimination that you know exists in the countries that win the bid. Number two, there's no solvency because just because you host a huge sporting event doesn't mean that all of these problems disappear. The barrage of problems in countries like Qatar with the aforementioned groups, but they're not suddenly going to change the mindset and the traditional notions of a whole nation in the span of a month or two. That is unrealistic. I think that AF was clear down the bench that the majority of the problems that arise from these poorly organized and greed-driven sporting events are going to be mitigated to a certain extent on our side. That the treatment of its own citizens is not going to be as bad as they wanted to have on Brazil on their side. That the treatment of workers is not going to be as bad as what will happen to more Qatar's case studies on their side, like with migrants. So overall weighing then is on the extent of abuse. The greater justification is that abuse workers on the side because of the connotation of the audience, but also we say that there's less abuse on our side when it's one country. So one, even if corrupt countries will abuse workers on our side, it's about the extent of demand. At least it's not a huge stadium versus like a few buildings that we will have to like make on our side. But two, there are less time constraints in one country, so there's less rush to reduce the working standards and make sure that these workers are, not going to be contractual and are going to be actually paid on time and with minimum wage. So in the best case of Neg, you get all of these shiny benefits at the expense of people working behind the scenes, suffering. Clearly affirm.
All right, thank you very much. Can we have the third negative speaker to end the constructive part of the debate before the replies? Here.
Hey, can you hear me? Yes, sir. Look, the reason why the Olympics and these major sports events attract so much controversy is it's frankly a miracle that they can bring together every single country across the world, countries that are diametrically, ideologically opposed, countries that are literally still at war, and yet we can host a Winter Olympics in Pyongyang. It is a miracle. And the reason why sport can be so inclusive, it can reach every single person on the ground despite all of those differences, is the fact that we're able to overcome those controversies. That we don't seek to say, let's get rid of those controversies, let's pretend they don't exist, let's never give the recognition that the North Korean government is doing human rights abuses. It is that we grapple with that with maturity, that of course, we host a sports event and recognize that those human rights abuses occur, but we don't shun North Korea and say you should not be allowed to participate in sport, that we don't shun North Korea and say that no one should be exposed to your culture. And that was our case. Our case was that these sports events are really important in making the world more inclusive, are really important at genuinely providing people meaning. And I'm usually not a debater that likes to be like, let's do the meaningful cultural arguments of the economic ones. But here I am, because frankly, that is our case. And it's a case I don't think the opposition grapples with. Let's start with what they say. And I think this is the weighing that's really important in the debate. Because I think the other team is just very familiar with the kind of more standard version of this topic, which is as an active debate of should we host an Olympics? And that is why they run all the economic analysis, being like, it's not in your economic interest, it's going to cause you debt, etc. Is if you actually just believe their entire case, your harms that you're left with is China has incurred a bit of debt from the Beijing Olympics. And I'm like, okay, that seems a little bit bad. But it just doesn't seem like a big problem. Like countries can incur a little bit of debt. They certainly don't explain why the amount of debt that you incur over this event is literally like debilitating for your country. And I think this is the weighing that I want to give, is that the sacrifice to genuine sports is far more significant than an economic sacrifice, which we believe probably does happen, but it just isn't that important. And the reasons why sport is unique literally come out at first, and they don't grapple with the weighing at all through the debate. That weighing is that sport is uniquely accessible, that it is a form of culture and expression that has not been excluded in the same way that fine arts or things like, very high-end, highbrow forms of cultural expression have been captured. And that is why so many people participate in it and why so many people view it, because it's genuinely meaningful to them and because every single person on their day-to-day life as a kid has participated in it. And the second reason is that it's uniquely unifying. There is a reason why there are such strong reactions to the monopolization of sport by major powers. The fact that the value of the equipment that you buy makes you better at sports is a resounding statement that the Olympic Committee has said is a problem and we need to tackle. And that is because sport is seen as the commonality that ties people together despite differences, that brings them closer. And that was a very important message and an important feeling with sport. And the final reason is, as we explained, it just breaks stereotypes and perceptions. It is the one time that a redneck in America is ever going to see Usain Bolt, is ever going to see the flags of African nations that they literally could not be able to pronounce the names of, is ever able to appreciate the capabilities of other people of totally different skin colors to themselves, to see the culture of these countries and appreciate it, or at least be somewhat shaped by it. And the opposition in many ways sees this. When they speak about the power for sports to sports wash or shroud reputations, they know it genuinely is meaningful. They know it genuinely is important to people's expression. And it's unclear to me why they're unwilling to accept that there is a bullet they need to buy in terms of it is so important to people on the ground. And the reason is because we overwhelmingly win the question of how much does sports participation change, how much funding enters into sports under our side. And this is very intuitive. When you the novelty of it hosted in a different location every year, then you don't get the massive hype of the bidding process of who's going. It has a totally distinct style. You get specific rings, specific symbols, specific cultural motifs, specific architecture. That is when each and every Olympics literally becomes the same scene in Los Angeles that every year, year in, year out, less and less people show up to. That is why you literally lost so many people. Not to mention, as we explained, if you want to expand sport into developing nations, if you want to expand sport into Africa, if you want to expand sport into Southeast Asia, you need to build that interest by letting them host these events, which brought us to the second point, which also didn't get a response. This is the sole incentive for governments to invest enormous amounts of money, enormous amounts of effort, and to encourage people to play that sport, to purchase stadiums in their countries, to spend money actually encouraging people to invest or come into their country for these leagues. And all of this is important access to sport, which is genuinely meaningful to people. What do they contest? They first say that the trade-off of controversy is too extreme here. And as I pointed out in my introduction, the whole version of our case is that yes, controversies occur. Yes, sports washing is a bit of a problem, but the natural reaction by every single media organization is not to just be like, yeah, China's fine, Qatar's fine. It's that they obviously point these things out. And that is important because it actually draws attention and actually encourages these countries to change those things. What do you think Qatar does when it gets criticisms about the way that its migrant labor occurs under the World Cup? It actually needs to do things to show that it is changing its image. It needs to do things to assuage people that their stadiums aren't built off blood. And that is important because it's actually a tangible benefit that addresses human rights rather than their side, which says, this is a problem. Let's just scream at it and yell at it, and hopefully that fixes the problem. And the last thing is that I want to mention here is there is a trade-off of this controversy. As I said, it is important that the Olympics is inclusive, because otherwise you literally end up where you deny the fact that developing nations ever feel like they can be a part of these institutions. When you, as the opposition, get up there with the US hosting the Olympics year in, year out, and tell India, your government is too corrupt, your government is too developing, it doesn't have the infrastructure to host this event, how do you think the Indian government feels? How do you think the Indian people feel to actually attend that event on the ground? It's demeaning. It actually literally means that less people and less governments are ever willing to engage in these organizations, ever willing to participate or invest the enormous amount of money on sport that they do. The last quibble they give is off the quality of this venue, which we easily hands down win as well, because you have enormous government incentives to not cut costs and to not rush these buildings. They have decades to plan these events in advance. And that is why you get the most modern new buildings, not the decade-old building Los Angeles that you're reusing. That's why you get unique architecture with a novel, distinct atmosphere for every single one of these events. That is how you get air quality improvements in Beijing. That is how you actually get a positive media that seeks to make these countries less racist so they don't say slurs at a bunch of tourists that are going to come in. So at the end of this, all we prove is a crushing benefit on sport. They need to prove a significant harm on economics, which I don't think they do. Reasons are twofold. One, because these countries to an extent rationally opt in. Everyone knows that this is not profitable. You're not going to make a huge amount of money on it, but they make a number of trade-offs that are favorable. Why? First, because all of their economic analysis are double-edged swords. They say things like, it's really unpredictable and hard to plan. Yes, it is unpredictable because it is long-term, yeah? But long-term planning is really good. It's what allows you to actually plan an entire precinct from the ground up, rather than in the short term have to slap on another bit of infrastructure. They say things like, there's a huge number of tourists that come in all at once. Yes, those are tourists you never get under your side because you never host an event. But more importantly, we get some degree of constant tourism as people begin to recognize the city now, because they begin to form attachments and think that this place is pretty nice. But second is that, third is that they say, oh, you don't have enough money for these things. You get support and funding to an extent by these institutions like the Olympic body. And they finally say you can't use things afterwards. But like, these governments are pretty smart. They're not just going to like ban a building and then be like, I guess we have to pay the maintenance. They plan for this. And yes, that plan is imperfect, but they have a lot of information. And it's not as if they do this that badly. So at the end of this, yes, it's a bit unprofitable, but they incur a little bit of debt. That's okay. We get the benefit of an actual sport with unique, inclusive.
All right, thank you very much. Can we have the negatives reply speaker to end the debate for the negative team? Here.
Audible? I'm assuming so. 3, 2, 1. The silver bullet of the affirmative case in their own minds is these events are expensive and consequently likely to run at a loss. I think they prefer this strategy in this debate because it allows them to not rebut our economic benefits at all, but instead frame it as, well, we're just winning because you have to overcome this huge loss, and that's inherently a bad thing. There are many problems with that we observe. The first is that if you check your notes, the claim that these events are huge creators of debt is never structurally demonstrated. Numbers are given, they are asserted, but they are not structurally demonstrated. We are generous in this debate and we are like, fine, let's argue on those terms. Our claim is that debt is clearly not the worst thing that can happen to a country in this debate. The intuition to ground this is just many good things that countries can do for their own development cost money and incur debt. For instance, I would be surprised, I'm interested to hear if affirmative reply would be willing to do this, that if the affirmative team would oppose developing nations going into debt, for instance, to do welfare projects to increase the cost of living. Like, you cannot just say debt is bad and end the argument there. Our claim is this was worth it. Sorry, can I stop the speech for a second? All good. Sorry, stop. We say this is worth it because it provides the unique justification to invest in robust public transport infrastructures, because it provides the unique justification to invest in housing that is affordable and medium density, that is needed to accommodate the huge tourist population that comes with a sporting event. It provides unique justification to build sporting infrastructure that is used by populations to grow their grassroots sport. It provides unique tourism that is massive in the short term and rises in the long term. Their claim at Second Affirmative is that these are produced by exploitative labor. There's no reason that's unique to this, but obviously that's just a justification against ever developing public transport or housing. Like, that argument doesn't outweigh. The reason you outweigh our economic analysis in this debate as important is the affirmative team's analysis starts and ends with the word debt. They say it's bad. There's no reason, though, that they extend it to any other intrinsic harm in the debate. They just say, oh, that would be terrible. Maybe you believe that intuitively, but you ought not. They have not proven that. It's clearer to see how our economic benefits manifest in people receiving housing that they otherwise wouldn't, having access to transport to get to work, how businesses benefit from tourism and the cultural attention that durably is placed on those nations. I think we do win the question of economics, but our win expands to a clear one on the question of culture, because we provide virtually unrebutted a unique way to break stereotypes and to promote cultural knowledge about countries. We explain at Bella and at Eugene and at me, that's deeply meaningful to world political cultures and ultimately to give people a sense of national pride and hope. We explain that it's a unique way to get scrutiny on countries that bid for the Olympics. Because it's true, Qatar has a problem of migrant labor. That does not start or end with the World Cup, but I would contest in the counterfactual where Qatar never held the World Cup, that would be far less spoken about. There'd be far less international pressure to modify that, and that is important. But thirdly, we say that it suppresses grassroots engagement in sport, because now people don't feel ownership over sport. They never see it in their own countries. They never see themselves as being able to have ownership over it, and they don't connect it to their nation. We think that's disastrous for grassroots sport, and it's disastrous for national culture. Affirmative imagine a world in which international sport is a hollowed out, Americanized event that happens in the same aging stadium in Los Angeles every 4 years. That's a sad world for developing countries culturally and economically, and it's a sad world for sport. If you have a heart, negative team are clearly the one that's got there, but we've got your head as well.
All right, thank you. Can we have the F reply?
Hello. Sorry, it's quite like this. Okay. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, and 1. The reason why negative clearly loses is they don't defend hosting, right? Cultural expression. Olympics is multiculturalist and features everyone's culture, regardless of who hosts. Do people care about sports? You will turn your TV on and watch your Ronaldos and Messis, regardless of who hosts. The only way negative tried to give was, well, maybe that isn't so bad, without, as the negative reply says, structurally proving this. But when it came to the benefits of the sports that can be featured, athletes that will be helped, the workers that won't be abused, the op block was riddled with assertions against the reality of abuse, that it is greater when you have the justification of a World Cup behind you, that it is greater when you have the justification of every other world waiting on you, so you have to build that stadium, so you have to care about us, so you have to put your own human rights on the background. So if Neg wants to hold their hands and sing Kumbaya, while the citizens in their own country lose their homes, starve, and pay debt for years, then I think they should just lose outright. A few debate-winning things in my speech. Firstly, why do host countries bid? Secondly, is the host country better off? Thirdly, abuse. And then lastly, make the sport better? Actually, I'll just start with the views. So they say awareness. Even if I don't respond to this, they never prove the tipping point, right? So I don't know why a few more, a bit more backlash is going to ever change what Qatar is going to do. So I don't know why this benefit is so important in this debate. But one, we flip this, right? Because people care about sports the most, and that is a premise they never respond to. In fact, concede to down the debate. And given that people care about sports the most, you give them justifications on their side. Qatar isn't that bad. Maybe we can excuse Qatar or China for a bit because we have to care about sports the most. Stop ruining one for everyone. But we said that OP agrees they only care about the sport. So they won't care about the Qataris dying when they're watching Ronaldo kick some goals. We say that thousands of workers get abused every single time. And third next tries to be sneaky and say, they get to prepare long term. Besides the fact that this is asserted and built up third negative, this is untrue because bidding, as they concede to down the debate, happens every 4 or 6 years. And they can try to say that this is symmetric, but here's our weighings throughout the debate that they never respond to. One, time constraints. When you need to rush a whole new stadium, when you need to rush 5 new hotels, that is when more workers get abused versus on our side, when a stadium is already built and you just need to renovate it a few more times. Secondly, the fact that a permanent host doesn't need to make a whole new facility, the amount of abuse, if there is any, is less because the projects are inherently less each time they need to renovate. Secondly, then, let's talk about why do host countries bid? They say they do it for money, they'll get money. Besides the fact that this is factually untrue, it's inherently unpredictable, right? This is exclusive when it's constrained by time. But even if it's not, it's the fact that they do it because of desperation. So they say they do it to have infrastructure packages. But this is an incredibly inefficient way of getting stuff done because you divert so much use of this project. We say it's an irrational ego that they never respond to. Third thing then, is the host country better off? They say the cash injection is good, but we point out that the cash injection is likely not all good, not good at all. Sure, you put 5 billion into a better road, but you also put 5 billion into stadium you will use. That's 5 billion wasted. But they say you will have better infrastructure, and I just like to come back with the whole ghost stand and debt thing that we said, right? We said maintenance costs because they're never used, and maybe Meg can assert that they are used, and maybe they can assert that infrastructure is going to be used, but our premise was ultimately unresponded to, that they are often inaccessible because they are made in areas that are so far from civilians because of things like security issues. They are not used because these events and localities are often smaller. So third Neganapay can say it's not a bit of a problem, but it's bad on the citizens of that country. The reality is that is shouldered and paid by them and not FIFA, and at best it's just unsure why this is exclusive. So obviously, in terms of extent, we prove it a lot more structurally. Lastly, on culture. They say culture is not important in this debate, but then they pull out so much rhetoric on we pull countries together. By the way, the 2014 Olympics were in Pyeongchang, South Korea, but they say it will be demeaning to developing countries that they can't host an event. As we say, people care more about participating more than hosting. Lastly, do you make the sport better? They say you make the sport less fun. They say you politicize the sport. You say they spread the sport. We would say that we flip all of this because we proved that we removed the point of controversy and politicization, if not in the host country being decided, in the host country in the bidding process itself. Never mind that they never respond to the fact that we better athletes. Never mind to the fact that we prove that you have more sports and more athletes that can be accommodated. Never the fact that we prove why these workers are going to be tortured, why these workers are going to die because of the fact that you put them on the heel of the World Cup and you put them on the heel of the Olympics. Very proud to oppose.
All right, thanks. Can all the speakers, first of all, shake hands, I guess, virtually, All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for that very high quality debate. So it was very enjoyable. But the panel came eventually to a split decision. So with myself being the person that holds 2 votes in the room, the decision went in favor of the negative team. So congratulations to USU 2, commiserations to UPD 2. I think it was a really good debate. It was a very narrow, very close debate. I think the panel generally agreed that it was a close debate as well. So yeah. So let's discuss the verdict. 3 main questions that I think were important for deciding who won the round. The first on how likely will economic harms accrue for the smaller hosts if they do get to host it. The second question is which side is more likely to harm sports, and thirdly, which side deals with human rights abuses better. So let's first talk about economic harms and whether or not they accrue to the smaller hosts. And the reason why this clash was one of the most important clashes in this round at least, was because the negative team at some point did concede that they wanted countries in the global south like Africa and ASEAN to gain some chances exposure for their culture and things like that. So necessarily there is some reasonably significant concern over the economics of hosting the Olympics, for example, as a smaller nation that may be poorer off. So given that that's the case, what were some of the things that were pushed? And I think the affirmative quite strongly and convincingly pushes that there's massive expenditure involved in the organizing and hosting of these international sporting events. So they point out that there's immense debt that is going to be likely accrued by these nations. They explain that it is very likely that there's a lot of wastage in infrastructure, in that a lot of these stadiums become empty or like they are very far away from civilian access and therefore cannot be integrated significantly within the broader communities after the international sporting event is over. Now, I think the negative in this debate concedes that there is some expenditure in the short term. So they explain that, well, like there obviously is some degree of spending as a necessary component of doing anything in this round, be it infrastructure building or just hosting an international event. But they say that there are long-term benefits that come from tourism and the conversion of facilities and infrastructure for general use. So for example, transport, and the stadium being converted into a sports hub like the one in Sydney, for example, or China as well. So how did I evaluate this particular set of arguments from both the F and NEC? The first thing I'll point out is that I think at the end of this debate, the maintenance cost argument seems to be symmetric, as rightly pointed out by the second negative speaker, given that those transport systems and those amenities will need to be maintained by smaller nations regardless. So if you are a smaller nation that chooses to spend money on developing your transport, you will have to also do that. You also have to incur costs for maintaining the transport. And the difference though, and the delta in the debate, so to speak, is that it is easier in the negatives world to justify spending a lot more money on these things than they previously could have. And therefore, it was quite important that they had a chance at the very least to have these events be one of the reasons why they built those things. So even if it incurs some level of debt and expenditure in the short term, it seems that there is a higher likelihood of those particular forms of structures and I guess amenities being built for these less developed countries. And that's the reason why the maintenance cost probably symmetric, but there's a higher likelihood of these smaller developing countries actually developing their infrastructure. And I think that's one of the reasons why I think on the first level, they are slightly ahead there in this issue. But the second thing I think that happens in this round is that I think there was a lot of discussion around whether or not these economic harms were likely to, I guess, persist into like one of those things like debt spiral. So like the question there is whether or not the long-term benefits of the negative team like tourism and things like that would be sustained. So I am convinced at the end of this debate that the tourism may not persist over time. I think the affirmative team points out why that attention might necessarily be short-lived. But given that the long-term benefits potentially and the likelihood of building those facilities and being able to necessarily have those facilities probably was something that meant that even though that wasn't significant, maybe there's no long-term tourism, but it did seem like there were long-term benefits that would eventually help the smaller hosts. So the economic expenses that were described by the affirming team seem to be necessary for that infrastructural growth at the end of this debate, and therefore the economic risks being posed to smaller hosts seem to be something that was acceptable for the purposes of debates. Therefore, even if I think the affirming side can prove that there are some economic harms in the short terms, I think the negative team is able to prove that in the long term there are some benefits that outweigh it. The second clash then, which side is more likely to harm sports? So I think this is quite interesting because both sides agreed that multiculturalism was important to sport. And so like in this case, affirmative says that, we will have international participants and there will be interactions there anyway in the permanent host country. But the negative team pushes back against this by pointing out that Americanized sports events seem to be bad. Then the affirmative team says in response that, well, if you don't like America, then you can have it in India. But I'm not really sure why why India would be the likely counterfactual in the debate, especially if the affirming team actually sets up that this debate probably happens in cases of like uncontroversial hosts like the US. And given that in setup, the affirmative team points towards a more developed context, for example, that they have more basic levels of facilities and they have the ability to host, it seems a little bit unfair or uncharitable for the response of India to hold true in this round, given that that doesn't seem to be the likely context that the affirming team sets up. So I think even without the Americanization argument in the round, it is the logic within the argument from the negative team is that basically hosting the Olympics, I guess, in the same place all the time often just means that people get bored of the setting and therefore will be less likely to go spectate the sport, go visit, I guess, whatever country that it's consistently being hosted at. And as a consequence of that, you get significantly less cross-pollination in terms of culture. So while affirmative tries to mitigate this by saying that international athletes will continue to interact with each other anyway, I think the greater scale of harm that they don't necessarily respond to completely is this harm of the spectators themselves being less involved progressively over time and being lost quite significantly. I don't think there's a clear response to that. And so, like, given that both sides agreed that multiculturalism was important to sport, implicitly, I think this clash was agreed to be quite important as well, because it's what makes sports, it's something that makes sports meaningful. Okay, part of this clash also included the exchange on like whether or not these particular countries can have sustained local grassroots sports hubs. And so one of the arguments we get from the affirming team is that we have civilian stadiums being very inaccessible. As a consequence of that, it's unlikely that these sports hubs are likely to proliferate in the way that the negative team tries to push. The first thing I would point out here is that there were examples being given in this debate about, I guess, the Sydney example with like how it's become a sports hub and it's reinvigorated that particular region. But more importantly, I think it's unclear. It's a lot of the debate assumed that there would be infrastructure built so that people could get to those stadiums. And to some degree, like the affirming team seems to concede this as well. So it's unclear for me as to which characterization of the civilian stadiums being inaccessible, like between the characterization of accessible stadiums versus like, inaccessible stadiums versus these particular countries wanting to build infrastructure to help to have transport networks and things like that. It seems like there's a little bit of like inconsistent characterization that couldn't be agreed on there. So I'll point out that this debate, like on this particular deadlock, seemed less important because I was not persuaded very cleanly by either side on how likely this is going to take place. Yeah. So the other thing that happens under this clash is this point on like from the negating team, which is that there's less reason to watch because people hate the So the negative team pushes that there's less reason to watch sport because people hate the US, and therefore and this matters because the overall demand for sport activities and just spectatorship and things like that, all that decreases. I don't think that was a very clean response to this, as I pointed out earlier. So at the end of the day, I was more likely to believe that the affirming team's policy would eventually harm sports. And even if the argument from the affirming team about debt stands at the end of this debate, the spirit of sports and the meaning of sports as a clash was weighed as more important over the pure economic considerations in this round by the negating team. So I think the negating team provided explanations for why sports was incredibly unique in this debate, or why exactly the spirit of sports in this case necessarily meant that we had to look past the pure economic considerations that were in this round. We needed to look at the cultural immersion, the cross-pollination, and also the ability for us to look at those human rights abuses and to integrate basically with the rest of the world. And they discuss it by analyzing how sports has historically and typically been quite unifying as an arena. So I think at the end of this clash, I was more likely to also believe that even if the affirming team won the first clash on economic considerations, which I don't think they necessarily do, this spirit of sports clash was weighed as more important than the economic considerations in this round, I think. The third clash in this round, which side deals with human rights abuses better? So in this round, it's quite interesting because the affirming team seems to say that human rights violations are less important in this round, but then a lot of their material also was centering around this idea of worker conditions, right? And worker conditions being much worse in the negating team's world. I guess they use this kind of as a response, basically, to the negating team's argument. So what I would point out here is that the reason why this was unpersuasive, or that the workers' conditions was less likely to be a problem at the end of this debate, because when we were looking at the notes, at our notes, and when I was looking at my notes, it seems like the negative team already responds to this by pointing out that, well, international media crews are going to be always at that rotating hosts space, right? And if they are always going to be in that rotating host space, then it means that you can do things like point out, like, I guess in the case of Qatar, the LGBTQ rights problems, but also like the way this analysis implicitly responds to workers' conditions is that presumably even if the scrutiny is short-term from the media, the workers' conditions would still be quite a central story if people were basically being abused or being exploited and being underpaid and overworked, right? It seemed like at the end of this debate, I was more likely to believe that those workers' conditions wouldn't go out of scrutiny. And I think the reason why that is true is because the negating team's structural analysis of how attention is likely to accrue for problematic human rights violations continued to persist at the end of this round. So when I'm weighing out the likelihood of workers' conditions being overlooked, it seemed less likely in this round, given that the argument about more scrutiny was not particularly well responded to from the affirming team. So while I think the affirming team suggests that human rights violations are less important for the consideration of this round, it's unclear how this form of weighing, or this metric of weighing, was more important than the way that the negating team proposed what was important for this debate, which was, I guess, like the spirit of sport and things like that. I think that weighing was a lot more explicit from their side. I think it was a bit of a I guess the affirming team was a little bit quick to dismiss that particular portion of the debate. The other part of this was like this. The other part of this clash about human rights abuses was like affirmative team saying that, you know, there's only short-term scrutiny, but I'm not sure how this is a clear response, given that the negating team proves structurally there's consistent pressure in the long term, given the wave of progressivism that you see right now with like the Black Lives Matter movement. It seems like generally people around the world tend to be a lot more woke, and therefore it seems that it is more likely that the trend is towards having more sustained attention around these issues. And so I was more likely to believe that having a permanent host country would eventually be detrimental to the ability for us to scrutinize human rights abuses. And I was quite, I did believe that this was quite an important clash as well for litigating for deciding who won this round, for the reason that human rights abuses seem to be quite a massive, I guess, like a massive issue, given that there's a lot of controversies around host countries for that very reason. And that's the reason why at the end of this round, the debate went to the negating team. Please remember to fill out your feedback for all the teams. USU, can you guys please like make sure that all the USU teams like fill out feedback, because we actually haven't gotten feedback from them. Yeah.